There is a particular silence that forms around a child who grows up feeling unseen. It is not the peaceful quiet of safety, but the hollow quiet of absence, the kind that echoes in small moments, a question unanswered, a glance overlooked, a need dismissed without thought. Over time, the ignored child learns to shrink, not because they want to be small, but because their world offers no space for them to be anything else. This is not a story of dramatic wounds. It is a story of subtle erasures, the missing warmth that shapes a nervous system, the invisible patterns that follow them into adulthood, the emotional ghost they carry in rooms where they long to matter. Here, we trace the inner landscape of a child who grew up overlooked, and what becomes of them when they learn to see themselves again. There is a moment, small, almost weightless, when a child begins to understand that they are not fully seen. It rarely happens in a dramatic scene. More often, it takes place in the gentle pauses of daily life. A question that drifts unanswered, a drawing held up with bright eyes that never receives a glance, a story interrupted by a parent's sigh or distant stare. The child, still learning how the world works, interprets these moments not as oversights, but as truths. I must not matter enough to be noticed. This realization doesn't crash into them. It settles, softly, quietly, like dust on a forgotten shelf. In the early years, a child assumes that every emotional climate is normal. If love is warm, they believe warmth is the world. If love is inconsistent, they believe inconsistency is fate. And if love is absent, muted, distracted, or unreachable, they believe that their own presence must be the problem. The ignored child absorbs this absence not as an external reality, but as an internal flaw. The first quiet realization begins as a misalignment. Something feels off, though they cannot name it. Other children seem to have a different kind of connection, parents who look directly at them, who bend down to listen, who notice the small shifts in their voice. The ignored child watches these exchanges with a sense of distance, as though the world is happening behind a pane of glass they cannot reach through. They learn to observe before they ever learn to express, and inside, a subtle withdrawal begins, not out of rebellion, but out of understanding. The child learns that speaking louder does not bring closeness, that needing things does not guarantee response, that their emotions often fall into the quiet spaces of a home already full of other people's concerns. This is where the first fracture forms between the child and their own voice. Their needs don't disappear. They simply become quiet. They tuck their desires into the corners of their mind. They practice being low maintenance, easy, unnoticeable. They hope that if they shrink enough, maybe they will fit into whatever small space is available for them in the lives of those they love. Psychologically, this first realization marks the beginning of emotional deactivation, a coping strategy where the child reduces their outward expression to avoid further pain. Instead of reaching outward, they turn inward. Instead of seeking comfort, they seek invisibility. The brain learns, do not expect too much. Do not take up space. Do not remind them you are here. The nervous system, attuned to silence, adapts to survive within it. But even within this adaptation, a conflict begins to form. A child is wired for connection. A child longs to be mirrored, held, responded to. And yet, their environment teaches them the opposite. This conflict does not erupt into chaos. It sinks into the bones. It shapes how they look at the world, how they look at themselves. They begin to regulate their emotions alone, long before they are developmentally ready. They comfort themselves in ways that do not resemble comfort at all, through stillness, through self-erasure, through pretending they never needed anything in the first place. The turning point within this chapter is subtle but profound. The moment the child stops trying, the moment they stop holding up drawings, the moment they stop calling for attention, The moment the effort to be seen feels heavier than the disappointment of being ignored. Their silence is misunderstood as independence, but beneath it lies something fragile: resignation. And yet, even here, there is a small spark, something that refuses to disappear completely. A quiet hope that maybe one day, someone will look closely enough to notice the softness they protected like a secret. This hope is not loud. It lives low in the chest, steady and patient. The first quiet realization is not the end of their story. It is the beginning of a complex emotional landscape, one shaped by longing, resilience, and the delicate ache of wanting to be seen. Silence does not appear without origin. The ignored child grows inside an emotional climate shaped long before they can name it. The quiet surrounding them is not simply the absence of attention. It is the echo of the adult's inner worlds, the noise of unspoken burdens, the weight of unprocessed histories that spill into the spaces where attunement should have lived. For many children, the silence begins with distracted caregivers, not malicious, not unloving, simply overwhelmed. A parent stretched thin by work, exhaustion, or the daily weight of survival might become emotionally distant without realizing how deeply the absence lands on a child. The adult assumes the child is fine. The child assumes the adult's distance is a verdict. If they don't turn toward me, maybe I'm not worth turning toward. Other times, the silence originates in caregivers who are emotionally unavailable, not because they lack affection, but because they lack the capacity to express it. Adults who were never nurtured often struggle to nurture. Their own childhoods may have taught them that emotions are inconvenient, that needs must be hidden, that vulnerability invites pain. Without intending to, they pass this emotional restraint to the next generation. The child learns to mirror the same internal dimming. And then there are families where chaos overshadows connection. Illness, conflict, instability, financial crisis, addiction, any overwhelming circumstance can consume the emotional bandwidth of a household. The ignored child becomes invisible not because they are unloved, but because the environment is too loud, too stressed, too fragmented for their needs to register. They adapt by becoming quiet, as though trying not to add another ounce to an already heavy world. In some homes, the silence begins with intergenerational wounds, patterns passed down unconsciously. Perhaps the parent grew up unseen too. Perhaps love in their family was functional, but not tender. Practical, but not intimate. They may physically provide, but emotionally retreat, believing their presence is enough even when their attention is missing. The child absorbs this coded message. You are safe, but you are not prioritized. And slowly, they learn to lower their expectations to match what is consistently offered. The most painful origins are the ones that feel subtle. The parent who listens but never asks deeper questions. The adult who provides but rarely looks directly into the child's eyes. The home where everyone talks but no one truly acknowledges. Nothing overtly harmful happens, yet something essential is missing. Psychologically, children do not interpret these patterns as external failures. They interpret them as internal truths. They think, if I were more interesting, they would notice. If I were less trouble, they would look at me. If I were different, maybe they'd care. This is the quiet tragedy. Children assume responsibility for the emotional gaps of their caregivers. Instead of questioning the environment, they reshape themselves to fit it. The silence begins to alter the child's inner world. They become skilled at sensing when not to ask, not to seek, not to hope. They learn to read emotional cues quickly, adapt instantly, soften themselves constantly. The absence of recognition becomes a familiar backdrop to their life, a background hum they stop noticing, like an appliance that has been running for years. But beneath the adaptation lies something more fragile, a belief that their presence is optional, that their needs are interruptions, that their voice is dispensable. And yet, even in these early origins, There is a softness that does not die. A flicker of longing remains, a quiet wish for someone to notice the small things, how they hold their breath when they speak, how their eyes shine in excitement, how they pretend not to care when they are disappointed. The turning point of this chapter is not a revelation. It is recognition. The understanding that the child's invisibility was not born from their inadequacy, but from the limitations of the adults around them. That the silence they grew inside was inherited, not deserved. This truth does not heal everything, but it opens the door. From here, the child's internal landscape becomes clearer. They are not invisible because they lack light. They simply grew in a place where no one looked long enough to see it. When a child grows up unseen, their brain adapts in ways that are both brilliant and heartbreaking. The human nervous system is shaped not only by what happens to us, but by what doesn't happen. The comfort that never arrives, the eyes that never meet ours, the attunement that never settles into our bones. Emotional neglect leaves no bruises, yet its imprint lies deep in the architecture of the mind. The ignored child learns, on a biological level, to survive without connection. The first shift occurs in the realm of hypervigilance. Children are wired to seek cues from caregivers, their facial expressions, tone of voice, emotional presence. When those cues are inconsistent or absent, the brain heightens its scanning behavior. The child becomes an expert in reading microsignals, the slightest sigh, the smallest shift in mood. They become watchful, not because danger is present, but because attunement is not. The brain learns, stay alert, you are on your own in here. Over time, the nervous system develops a subtle hum of tension, an internal readiness to manage disappointment, to anticipate emotional emptiness before it arrives. This persistent alertness shapes how they regulate emotions as they grow. The child may appear quiet, obedient, or easy, but internally they are constantly self-monitoring, suppressing feelings that have no place to land. The second adaptation is withdrawal. When attempts at connection repeatedly fail, the brain recalibrates. It begins to dim emotional expression as a way to reduce pain. If reaching out does not create closeness, the brain protects the child by reducing the impulse to reach at all. This withdrawal is not sadness, it is strategy, a form of emotional efficiency. Why express what will not be received? This internal dimming shapes the child's identity. They learn to mute their excitement so it cannot be ignored. They soften their disappointment so it cannot be dismissed. They minimize their needs so they cannot be rejected. In the absence of acknowledgement, their emotional palate becomes quieter, neutral, controlled. The third psychological pattern is attachment insecurity. Depending on the nature of the emotional neglect, the child may develop avoidant tendencies, appearing self-sufficient, independent, even detached. This is not true independence. It is the armor built when dependence once led to emptiness. Other children may develop anxious patterns, craving closeness but expecting distance, seeking affirmation but fearing abandonment. But for the ignored child, avoidant attachment is often the core. It's safer not to need anyone. Yet beneath avoidant armor lies a longing that never died, only hid. Another profound impact of being unseen is the disruption of self-concept formation. A child's sense of identity grows when caregivers mirror their emotions. You're excited. You're sad. You're thoughtful. You're brave. These reflections help the child understand who they are. When reflection is absent, the child grows without a clear internal mirror. They learn to guess who they might be based on survival, not expression. They do not learn who they are. They learn who they must be to avoid pain. This absence of mirroring can lead to muted self-awareness, a tendency to doubt their feelings, a belief that their inner world is foggy or undefined. They often become adults who say, "I don't know what I want. I don't know what I feel. I don't want to burden anyone." Not because they lack depth, but because no one helped them discover it. The turning point in understanding this neuropsychology is recognizing that these adaptations were not flaws, they were solutions. The brain, brilliant as ever, adjusted to an environment where the child was not emotionally held. Their silence was self-defense. Their independence was survival. Their invisibility was learned, not chosen. But the brain is not fixed. What was once adaptive can be unlearned. What was once protection can soften. What was once silence can become voice. Beneath the neurological patterns lies a simple truth. The child was never invisible. They were simply growing in a place where no one knew how to see them. Inside every ignored child, a quiet and complicated tension begins to form. It does not appear suddenly. It builds slowly, through small ruptures, tiny disappointments, and the subtle ache of needing what never arrives. By the time they grow older, the conflict has woven itself so seamlessly into their identity that they barely recognize it as conflict at all. It simply feels like who they are. At the heart of this struggle lies a paradox. They long deeply to be seen, yet fear what being seen might cost. The longing is instinctual. No child enters the world wanting isolation. They want attention, not for validation, but for connection. They want to be understood, mirrored, acknowledged. They want their joy noticed, their sadness comforted, their presence affirmed. This longing is not dramatic. It is soft, steady, built into the architecture of being human. But alongside this longing grows a quieter fear. If they look at me, will they ignore me again? If I reach out, will they turn away? If I reveal who I am, will it matter? This is the hidden conflict, the emotional seesaw between desire and protection. The ignored child learns early that reaching outward leads to disappointment. They ask a question and receive silence. They share a thought and feel the room shift away. They wait for affection that never comes. Eventually, seeking becomes dangerous, connection becomes uncertain, and vulnerability becomes a risk they can no longer afford. So they split internally. One part still hopes, the other part hides. And this split follows them into adulthood. Psychologically, this conflict manifests as ambivalent visibility. They want to be chosen, but they minimize themselves. They want intimacy, but they avoid emotional exposure. They crave closeness, yet instinctively pull away when someone gets too near. To the outside world, they may seem calm, self-contained, even indifferent. But inside, they are balancing a lifetime of contradictory impulses. This inner tension also shapes how they interact in relationships. A child who is ignored becomes an adult who struggles to believe that others will stay. They read small delays as rejection, neutral expressions as disinterest, and simple misunderstandings as abandonment. They brace themselves constantly, prepared to be overlooked again. Yet they rarely express this fear aloud. Instead, they shrink. They soften their voice. They explain themselves less. They ask for little. Not because they lack desire, but because desire feels dangerous. Another layer of this conflict lies in emotional suppression. When a child's feelings are consistently unnoticed, the brain learns to mute them. But muting emotions does not remove them. It only buries them deeper. Beneath the surface, the ignored child feels intensely, often more intensely than others, because their emotions have been held inside without release for years. This creates a fragile equilibrium. They feel too much, but express too little. They want too deeply, but expect too little. They care intensely, but reveal almost nothing. The turning point within this conflict comes when they begin to notice the cost of their own invisibility. Perhaps a relationship ends because they never voiced their needs. Perhaps a friend tells them, gently, that they are hard to read. Perhaps they feel lonely even when surrounded by people. Or perhaps they simply realize, one quiet evening, that they have spent years living smaller than they truly are. In that recognition, something inside shifts, not loudly, but unmistakably. They begin to understand that the conflict between longing and fear is not a flaw in their character, but a scar from their childhood. They see that their silence was once a shield, that their independence was once a survival strategy, that their self-erasure was never proof they were insignificant. It was proof they were adaptable. This awareness softens the internal battle. It gives them permission to hold both truths at once. They can still be cautious. They can still be tender. They can still move slowly. But they are also allowed to want, to speak, to reach, to matter. Healing is not the elimination of the conflict. It is the gentle integration of its parts. It is learning that longing does not make them weak, and visibility does not make them unsafe. And in this subtle reconciliation, the ignored child begins, very slowly, to return to themselves. Awareness does not enter loudly. It rarely arrives in a moment of crisis or confrontation. Instead, it slips in quietly, like light seeping beneath a door that has been closed for years. For the ignored child, now older, perhaps an adolescent, perhaps fully grown, the realization that their invisibility was not their fault emerges slowly, gently, but unmistakably. It often begins with comparison, not the harsh kind, but the observational kind. They notice how other people speak openly about their childhood memories, about being comforted, celebrated, listened to. They see how easily some express their needs, how naturally others expect to be cared for. And something inside them tightens. Why did that feel impossible for me? Why does closeness feel foreign? Why does being noticed still make my heart flinch? These questions mark the beginning of awakening. Sometimes awareness begins through relationships. A friend may look at them with quiet concern and say, "You never ask for help." A partner may gently tell them, "I can't read you when you're hurting." A mentor may ask, "What do you want?" And they realize, with a shock of honesty, that they do not know how to answer. These moments are small, but they land deeply. They reveal the parts of themselves that were shaped in silence. Other times, awareness breaks through during conflict. They might find themselves intensely upset over something minor, feeling ignored, overlooked, dismissed, and suddenly the emotion feels disproportionate to the moment. But beneath that intensity lies history. Years of unmet needs compressed into a single reaction. And as they sit with the feeling, they realize it isn't about the present at all. It's about the child they once were, the child who learned to swallow absence without complaint. Awareness can also come through softness, a moment of unexpected tenderness, a hand offered, a question asked with genuine curiosity, someone sitting beside them without rushing. In these moments, they feel something quietly unravel. It almost hurts, the way warmth does when you've lived too long in the cold. A voice inside whispers, "Was this always possible? Was I really supposed to feel this safe?" This kind of softness exposes a truth they hadn't been able to face. They were never meant to grow up unseen. They were never meant to carry silence alone. The neglect they endured was environmental, not personal. Psychologically, this moment marks the beginning of reframing, the shift from self-blame to contextual understanding. They start recognizing patterns. Their difficulty expressing emotions is not lack of depth. Their discomfort with attention is not detachment. Their fear of asking is not stubbornness. Their self-sufficiency is not a personality trait. It is a survival strategy. When this realization surfaces, it often brings grief. The grief of understanding how much they needed. The grief of seeing how little they received. The grief of noticing how their adult patterns still reflect old wounds. This grief is quiet, but profound. It is not bitterness, it is recognition, the heart finally acknowledging what the mind avoided for years. But along with grief comes something softer, compassion. Compassion for the child who tried so hard to be easy. Compassion for the adult who continued shrinking long after the environment required it. Compassion for the self who mistook invisibility as destiny. This compassion is the true turning point, because once they stop blaming themselves, they can begin to imagine another way of being. The awareness doesn't fix everything. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't immediately transform their habits. But it does something more essential. It opens a door. It invites curiosity. It makes healing possible. For the first time, they see the invisible thread that is woven through their life, and they understand where it came from. They are no longer walking in darkness. They are walking in dim light, with the truth finally visible. And in that quiet illumination, the ignored child begins to realize they were never unworthy, only unseen. They were never insignificant, only unrecognized. They were never the problem, only misunderstood. Awareness becomes the bridge between who they were and who they can finally become. There is a particular kind of courage required to return to oneself after years of feeling unseen. It is not the loud, heroic kind. It is quiet courage, the kind that whispers rather than roars. The ignored child, now aware of their history, begins learning something they were never taught: how to take up space in a world they once believed had no room for them. This process does not begin with action. It begins with permission. Permission to want. Permission to need. Permission to exist without justification. For someone who grew up shrinking, these permissions feel radical. Their body hesitates. Their voice wavers. Their mind questions whether they are allowed. Yet slowly, with gentleness and time, they begin practicing the art of showing up. The first step is reclaiming their internal landscape. They learn to listen to themselves, truly listen, to emotions they used to mute. At first, the feelings are faint, like distant echoes. Sadness that was once swallowed, anger that was once forbidden, joy that was once dimmed for safety. They begin naming emotions without apologizing for them. Naming is a form of visibility. Naming says, I am here, and what I feel matters. Soon they practice expressing these emotions outwardly, timidly at first. They tell someone, I'm struggling. They say, I didn't like that. They whisper, I need help. These phrases feel foreign, heavy, almost dangerous. But each time they speak them, the world does not fall apart. Nothing catastrophic happens. They learn that expression does not make them a burden. It makes them human. Another part of occupying space involves rebuilding trust with others. As a child, they learned that people might not show up for them. As an adult, they brace instinctively for abandonment or indifference. But healing asks them to test the world again, gently, cautiously, to let someone hold a piece of their truth, to allow someone to see a side they once hid. Trust is no longer an all-or-nothing leap. It becomes a slow, deliberate walk toward connection. They also learn to challenge a core belief they carried for years, the idea that quietness equals safety. In childhood, silence protected them, but now, silence isolates them. Healing means redefining safety. Safety becomes emotional honesty. Safety becomes boundaries. Safety becomes choosing relationships where visibility is welcomed, not punished. They start saying no without guilt, choosing presence instead of invisibility. Psychologically, this stage involves strengthening the sense of self, something that was once fragile or undefined. They begin exploring their preferences, desires, values, and identity outside the lens of survival. What do they like? What do they believe? What kind of life feels true to them? These are questions they may have avoided for years. Now they approach them with curiosity, not fear. There is a moment, often small, easily missed, where they realize something has changed. They voice a preference without apology. They express a need without shrinking. They feel irritation or sadness and allow themselves to sit with it instead of burying it. They exist in a room without trying to make themselves invisible. And in that moment, they are reclaiming space. Yet healing is rarely linear. There are days when the old patterns pull them back, when they silence themselves, when they apologize for emotions, when they feel undeserving of connection. But now, they notice these patterns with clarity. They speak to themselves gently. This is the old me. This is the child protecting themselves. But I am safe now. This gentleness becomes the anchor of their growth. The turning point of this chapter is the realization that occupying space is not an act of defiance. It is an act of belonging to the world, to others, to themselves. The ignored child learns that visibility does not demand perfection or performance. It simply requires presence. And slowly, beautifully, they begin to take their rightful place in the world, not by force, but by soft reclamation. They begin to fill their own life with themselves. They begin to exist fully, openly, without shrinking. This is the quiet revolution of healing, the moment a once invisible child learns to stand where they belong. Reappearance is not a dramatic entrance. It is not a triumphant declaration or a sudden surge of confidence. For the ignored child, reappearance feels like the quiet blooming of something that has been waiting for years beneath the surface, something tender, cautious, and profoundly human. It begins with presence. Not the forced kind, not the kind that demands recognition, but the simple act of showing up to one's own life. They start noticing themselves in moments where they once disappeared, speaking in a conversation without rehearsing, laughing without shrinking, allowing their emotions to rise without immediately pushing them down. These small, almost ordinary acts reveal something extraordinary. They are inhabiting their own existence again. A gentle reappearance means no longer editing themselves to fit into the smallest possible space. It means letting their voice have room, letting their thoughts take shape, letting their emotions be real, not hidden. For years, invisibility was a reflex, an instinct carved from childhood silence. But now, their presence becomes intentional. It becomes an act of healing. Psychologically, this stage reflects the integration of all the parts of them that were once fragmented. The child who longed to be seen, the adolescent who learned to stay silent, the adult who functioned while feeling hollow. These versions of themselves begin to coexist, not in conflict, but in conversation. They no longer exile the parts of themselves that felt needy or afraid. They welcome them home. This internal reunion softens their posture toward the world. Instead of guarding themselves from disappointment, they approach life with measured openness. Not naive, not unprotected, just open enough to receive what is good. Open enough to be changed by softness instead of hurt. Emotionally, they learn to hold themselves with the kindness they never received. They pause before self-blame. They speak gently to the parts of themselves that still ache. They offer understanding rather than judgment. This self-compassion is not indulgence. It is reparation, a long overdue tending to the wounds that formed in the quiet emptiness of childhood. Reappearance also means reclaiming joy, the quiet, subtle joy they once muted because no one was there to witness or share it. They allow themselves to enjoy small things without fearing there being too much. The warmth of sunlight on the floor, a favorite song played louder than usual, a moment of pure laughter with someone they trust. These small joys accumulate, forming the emotional scaffolding of a self finally allowed to feel. Relationships change as well. They begin choosing people who make room for their presence, people who listen without rushing, people who see without demanding. The ignored child, now reappearing, recognizes the difference between conditional attention and genuine attunement. They develop boundaries not to push others away, but to protect the new space they're learning to inhabit. Boundaries become an expression of self-worth rather than self-defense, and there comes a beautiful, quiet turning point. They stop believing that they must earn their right to exist. The reappearance is not about proving themselves, it is about allowing themselves to take up emotional space, allowing themselves to have needs, allowing themselves to be visible in their own life, not brightly, not loudly, but sincerely. As they integrate this new sense of presence, something inside grows light. Not the light of performance, but the light of truth, a soft radiance that comes from being connected to oneself. And this leads to the final understanding, the one that completes the arc of the story. They were never truly invisible. They were simply growing in a place where no one knew how to look. Now, with quiet bravery and gentle intention, they look at themselves, clearly, tenderly, fully. And in doing so, they step back into the world not as an echo, but as a whole presence. This is their gentle reappearance, a return not to who they were expected to be, but to who they always were underneath the silence.